Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, November 2nd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the gender gap in early voting numbers as they show good signs for the Kamala Harris campaign as women are outpacing men in a dramatic way in a number of battleground states. The voting electorate, which is comprised of nearly 50-50 gender breakdown, male to female voters, you are looking at the 2024 cycle looking very different when it comes down to early voting numbers that Republicans often do tout as indicators in states like Nevada and Georgia that they are on track for an electoral college victory, and yet when you break it down through a different set of demographic group rather than rural versus urban, and you're looking at it from the lens of gender and sex, you are going to find here that Kamala Harris is on track to do quite well in some of these battleground states should these numbers hold. Now, Kamala Harris's campaign has very much been reliant on, especially for the past 3 months, a consistent and clear sort of messaging when it comes down to an appeal to women voters across the nation. On issues like abortion, the Kamala Harris campaign is aligned with the opinion of nearly 70% of the nation. Donald Trump's campaign aligned with nearly a third of the nation. On topics like reproductive freedoms and access to contraception, things like Plan B, all across the board, Kamala Harris's campaign really hasn't had a misstep on topics like this issue. And a big reason for that is because the campaign itself and the Democratic ticket for the past 50 years has been on one side of the aisle, whereas Republicans have been vehemently opposed to issues like abortion, against reproductive freedoms happening in a number of states, in many cases also in opposition to any style, or not any style, any circumstance in which there would be an abortion, for instance, a mother's life at risk. For instance, in the examples of rape and incest, you have found that there are many states that have barred all types of abortion for any reason, whether short-term, late-term, whatever it is, because the abortion bans have been put into place because of the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Now, my big thing about the early vote is that I don't like to read too deep into it. I think there absolutely are indicators in certain areas and certain demographic groups that sort of paint a picture of what the election might look like, assuming these early votes maintain themselves through Election Day or slightly fade off between now and November. And a big reason for that is because, on one end, I trust the early vote in that it tells us some things, but I don't expect it to tell us the full story. If we were looking at the early vote numbers alone, you could draw a variety of different outcomes. You could say states like Nevada were solid red for the Republican Party based on what we're seeing online and the assumptions there, but then you could also say states like Pennsylvania, which have built up a tremendously high Democratic firewall, and say that Democrats are solidified in both of those states. Now, I will say and push back in that either state, both of them are going to be competitive. Both of them are going to be battlegrounds, and it really does come down to who turns out on Election Day and who they turn out for. But overall, the numbers here when it comes down to gender breakdown are positive for the Kamala Harris campaign and showed the Democrats to be in a good position, arguably in a similar way they were in 2022, which wasn't a phenomenal year for Democrats, but it was a year at which they won battleground states like Pennsylvania on the governorship and the Senate race, Wisconsin and Michigan on the governor race, Nevada in the Senate race, Arizona on the governor and Senate race, in Georgia on the Senate race there. In a number of battleground states, they kept these races Democratic holds, or in some cases, showed a strong showing for the Democratic ticket in some of these battlegrounds. And arguably, that's all Democrats can ask for in this cycle. Now, I'm sure many Democrats are looking to numbers like these and hoping that it matches what we see on Election Day. I'm here to ground you to and telling you that we are going to see a higher portion of men turn out on Election Day as compared to women. But when it still comes down to a broken down gender split by the end of this election, I do believe there will be more women voting in this election than men. That is how we have seen things broken down over the past 3 cycles, and I expect it to stay the same. It doesn't always indicate a victory, right? We saw more women than men vote in 2016, ended up with Hillary Clinton winning the national popular vote, but still, even though you still have a lot of women and men who vote in very opposite directions than what the majority of their demographic group do, and so a lot of the times it's about turnout, it's about enthusiasm, it's about excitement, it's about getting out the vote, and in some cases, it doesn't turn out in the levels that it needs to for Democrats or Republicans. In this case, the numbers align with the Kamala Harris campaign. And so Democrats have been looking for signs to say, are we in a good position? Are we on track to win in some of these battlegrounds? And the answer thus far, again, as I've been saying throughout the duration of this video, the answer is yes, especially in states like Pennsylvania and states like Georgia, where the gender vote gap here is large enough that it shows Democrats building up at least what they expect to be a buffer on their side of the aisle. And we can see it here in the Politico article. They've done an analysis for quite some time looking at where Democrats and Republicans have done quite well. Obviously, it's not a perfect science. You don't actually know how these early voters are going to vote until you actually get their ballots cast and counted. And so it's a bit of a balancing act in analyzing some of this data while also making sure, hey, wait a minute, I don't want to be in a position where I'm incorrectly predicting the outcome of an election just based on early voting signs, which is why you have to be very careful in the way you do analyze this. But Politico has found that in a number of battleground states, there is a 10-point gender gap in early voting thus far. 10 points, meaning you're seeing that women are at 55% in terms of turnout and men are at 45%. What we remember from the 22 cycle is that women did, in fact, make Democrats, put them in a good position for the 22 midterms. You can see that in that cycle, women, suburban voters, also specific to Latino voters, drove the election results in the 2022 midterms. Now, it's a bit of a different breakdown. Latino voters shifted away from the Democratic Party, and Democrats lost a number of seats in Florida. They lost ground in the governorship. They lost ground in the Senate race here. But women and suburban voters drove Democrats to victory in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Georgia and Arizona and Nevada and a number of the states that we see to be competitive today. And so in analyzing that and really unpacking what that data tells us is that historically, what we had seen in previous elections, that abortion never mattered as much as it does to the American public today, especially when even compared to 4 years ago, even in the day and age of the unfortunate passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Even then, abortion wasn't front and center in a way that it needed to be for the Democratic Party to have a slam dunk victory, because 2020, arguably, which was a very good year for Democrats, wasn't what I determined to be a slam dunk. It was still, some losses in the House, almost losing the Senate. Point being here, though, abortion was not front and center like it is in this cycle. Abortion bans that have been implemented because of Donald Trump's appointees to the Supreme Court have not been front and center in any presidential election. In fact, for the past 50 years, abortion has been a protected right by the Supreme Court for 49 consistent years. The last time there was a presidential election where Roe v. Wade was not in place was in 1972. That was the last time we had ever seen, in a presidential election, and Richard Nixon did quite well. But that was a different age. Today, we are talking about a 2024 cycle where abortion is front and center. And voters are making it clear at the door, to pundits, to journalists, that abortion is a top issue for them across these battlegrounds. And it isn't just the issue of abortion. I mean, we have seen women before drive the electorate in favor of the Democratic Party time and time again. What we know from historical context is that the male demographic group are often more beneficial for Republicans compared to the female demographic group. That's just how things are. But in terms of the recent day and age of the gender gap, it is widening in a way that is quite significant, but in a way that if women are turning out at a higher rate, like the early voting data actually shows, that's a good sign. That is a really good sign for the Democratic ticket, assuming that these numbers hold. And now, breaking down more and more of what we're seeing too, Republicans are getting concerned. The Donald Trump team has started to look at these early voting numbers and say, wait a second, we are lagging behind. In some cases, they say, we look good. Republicans are turning out at a higher rate, but again, still, the gender breakdown is worrisome because there are some Republican identifying women who are voting blue this cycle. You have people like Liz Cheney, who were Trump twice, that are now Harris 2024. People like Mike Pence that were Trump twice that are now not endorsing in this cycle. And I think that's a big reason why you're seeing some anxiety from the Republican Party. It also, and they do know this because voter registration data has become public, is that since Kamala Harris has gotten to the top of the ticket, we have seen a surge in young people of color registering to vote, and specifically young women of color. A good example is that with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, we have seen a dramatic increase in young Latino registration across the country. We've seen that in battleground states and in non-battleground states. The numbers here look good in terms of newly registered voters that might not be captured in by the new polls, by new data sets that just do make a difference in an election, but haven't yet been registered long enough to actually get some of these calls to their doors, calls or web detects, whatever it might be. They aren't receiving some of these data points and polls that could be better at predicting our election. And when you're taking a look too, Kamala Harris in Georgia, we are seeing that new voters are signing up, registering to vote. Georgia was decided by 11,779 votes in the last election. If Kamala Harris is turning out 120,000 new young voters to register to vote and vote for the first time in their lifetimes, you are going to find that a lot of these votes here could be the reason why Kamala Harris gets across the finish line this time around, especially if data seems to suggest that of the existing electorate, she's lost some ground, and so she needs to build it back up in any way possible, and that is where these numbers could come in. And so when you look at the trends across the battlegrounds, it really shows Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, women are outpacing men in early voting. A strong Democratic presence amongst young and what we determine to be infrequent voters, voters that only vote in presidentials or in some cases didn't vote in the last election. We see that a considerable portion of those, voting this time around in Georgia in the early vote did not vote in the last election. I think the number that we saw from the Secretary of State's office was somewhere around 20% of voters in this cycle in Georgia alone did not even vote in 2020. And in 2020, the presidential election turnout was the highest it had ever been since the 1900 election. That makes a difference. And so when it comes down to feasibility and it comes down to how Donald Trump wins the election, he has some work to do, right? You're looking at states across the board where Donald Trump's candidacy has been hinging on this surge in turnout amongst male voters across the nation. As the gender gap widens, the Republican Party becomes much more reliant on on male voters across the country. And you can see this clear as day in the way that they campaign and who they bring on stage. You are talking about people like Bryce Hall, whose demographic group, it turns down to influencer impact, pretty much resides amongst young men. You see the way that Donald Trump does an intentional outreach effort, even the way that his campaign brands itself, has very much been geared towards men. And you can see it too. Nikki Haley called it out on Fox News. She said that this whole bro-y style of campaigning and this style of the Trump wing of the party is actually turning off women voters in rates that doesn't help their campaign whatsoever, and it isn't being counterbalanced by an increase in male voter electorate. And that makes a difference. I think when you're looking at the battlegrounds, it really comes down to North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, all states where right now the Democratic ticket does in fact have that gender gap to their advantage, the voter turnout advantage that could determine who wins the election. And for me, if I'm looking at it from a Democratic standpoint, I would feel pretty comfortable looking at some of these numbers, even with the election day vote still yet to come in. Now, there was a lot of speculation in the last cycle, 22 is the last cycle, is what I'm referencing to, and all these conversations. Will women actually determine the outcome of the midterm elections? And for a while, many people were naysayers. They believed that, we weren't going to see this massive surge in favor of the Democratic Party, that Democrats weren't going to be able to weaponize, a number of issues and weren't going to be able to be in a position where a lot of things like the economy, where Democrats were looking to turn it around on Republicans and say, actually, the economy's good. That wasn't landing with voters. On issues like healthcare, we were going to see the Democrats were going to try to talk about how Republicans were going to overturn Obamacare should they win back the majority. But it didn't land well, one, because Biden was president, and two, because it wasn't an issue that was going to be something that Democrats were able to message on correctly. And so, in a way, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, the Democratic Party resurged. We saw it. Nationally, swing states, special elections, the numbers went from Republicans being on track for a very much dominating victory to Democrats actually holding their own. And a big question of this, is this going to be something that is inspired and driven by women voters across the country? The answer? Yes. We saw that women voters were the reason why Democrats were able to hold on to so many key Senate races, flip a Senate race from red to blue, and hold numerous governorships, doing even better than they did in 2018, which is fascinating to think about because 2018 was the Democrat plus 8 national electorate in Donald Trump's term. That was the style of that election, and what happened there was Democrats did well. Democrats right now could very well do well again. Assuming that the gender breakdown benefits Kamala Harris in the same way it benefited Democrats in 22 and arguably even benefited Democrats in previous presidential elections, they're going to be in a good position come this cycle on Election Day, after Election Day, should these numbers hold. Now, there's no guarantee that they do, and I will say this election is closer to a toss-up today than it was yesterday and the day before that. But all we know is that it has been a toss-up for a very long time. Donald Trump has a 50% chance of winning, according to FiveThirtyEight. Kamala Harris had a 49% chance. That's a difference from the numbers that we saw previously, where Donald Trump the day before was at a 51-49, the day before that, 53-47, the day before that, 52-48, and a week before that, 55-45. It's a tightening of the race in a positive direction for Kamala Harris. And while the early voting numbers aren't influencing this forecast and aren't changing the way that FiveThirtyEight has done its methodology and understanding of the election forecast, it does make a difference, especially in the way that people on the outside are able to perceive this, and they can see that there is optimism here. The signs, if they were pointing to a Donald Trump victory, would be clear as day. They're not clear as day, but they aren't screaming that Kamala Harris is on track for a landslide either. We know this election is going to be close, but if Democrats do win it, it will be nearly entirely on the backs of women voters across the country, just as it was for Democrats in 2022. Because of issues like abortion becoming front and center in a presidential race for the first time in 50 years. Because reproductive freedoms and abortion bans and concerns around contraception and Project 2025 have now become main portions of this campaign and how Kamala Harris messages, how Donald Trump tries to anti-message on this point. It's something that makes a difference. And it is clear in the voting numbers today that women voters are turning out at a higher rate when compared to men, putting warning signs on the Trump team that there is something that needs to change between now and Election Day and on Election Day if Donald Trump wants a fighting chance at winning this election. I think it'll narrow quite a bit, but I still think at the end of the day, we're going to see a higher turnout amongst women voters than men voters in this election. A big push for that, I do think, is going to be Kamala Harris's candidacy, issues like abortion, and an overall general sentiment that might land Democrats a victory in 2024 on the backs of these voters in a way that we had not seen in presidential elections for the past half century. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.